The old mansion on Maple Ridge had always looked impressive from the outside. Tall white columns, expensive cars in the driveway, and perfectly trimmed roses made strangers believe a happy family lived there. But behind those elegant walls, kindness had died years ago, and everyone knew who had killed it. Margaret Dawson. People in town called her the Queen. Not because she was kind, but because she expected everyone to bow before her. Her husband Richard had built a successful construction company from nothing. While he worked 16-hour days, Margaret spent his money, hosted charity galas for attention, and reminded everyone that without her name, they were nothing. Her servants feared her. Neighbors avoided her. Even relatives only visited during holidays because they had no choice. Margaret believed respect could be forced. She had never learned the difference between respect and fear. Whenever a maid accidentally broke a glass, "You useless idiot!" she would scream. "If I wanted incompetence, I'd hire children." One maid quietly cried in the kitchen. Margaret laughed. "Tears don't clean my floors." The woman resigned that same afternoon. Margaret didn't care. There are thousands of desperate people looking for work. Her husband watched all of this in silence. At first, he tried stopping her. "Margaret, people aren't machines." She rolled her eyes. "And that's why they'll always stay poor." Eventually Richard stopped arguing. Not because he agreed, because he was exhausted. Their son Ethan was different. As a child, he would secretly apologize after his mother humiliated someone. He once slipped $50 into the gardener's pocket after Margaret screamed at the old man for trimming the roses unevenly. "I'm sorry," little Ethan whispered. The gardener smiled sadly. "It's not your fault, son." But Ethan carried that shame for years. By the time he turned 28, he rarely came home. He married a gentle schoolteacher named Lily. Margaret hated her immediately. Margaret sneered during dinner. "My son could have married a lawyer, a surgeon, someone with class." Lily smiled politely. "I love Ethan." Margaret laughed. "Love doesn't buy private jets." Ethan placed his fork down. "It buys peace." Margaret ignored him. She spent years insulting Lily, calling her cheap, ordinary, forgettable. Every family gathering ended with Lily crying in the car while Ethan held her hand. Finally, they stopped visiting. Margaret acted like she didn't notice. If they can't handle honesty, that's their problem. Months turned into years. Phone calls became shorter. Birthdays became text messages. Then, even those stopped. Richard quietly kept in touch with Ethan. Margaret refused. "If he wants a mother, he knows where I live." Deep inside, she expected everyone to return eventually. Because they always had. Until one winter morning, Richard collapsed while leaving his office. Massive heart attack. Doctors fought for hours. They couldn't save him. At the funeral, hundreds attended. Employees, friends, old business partners. Everyone spoke warmly about Richard. They called him generous, patient, honest. Margaret expected similar sympathy. Instead, people politely nodded and walked away. No one hugged her. No one stayed to comfort her. Many remembered how she had treated them over the years. Kindness cannot be demanded after decades of cruelty. After Richard's death, reality arrived faster than she expected. She had never handled finances. Richard had. The company wasn't actually hers. Most shares had already been transferred to Ethan years earlier. Margaret exploded. "He betrayed me." The lawyer calmly replied, "No, ma'am. He protected the company." She stormed out furious. The expensive parties stopped. Luxury vacations disappeared. Staff members resigned one by one. Not because they weren't paid. Because they finally had the courage to leave. The mansion slowly became silent. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret made her own coffee. She hated it. One rainy evening, she slipped while carrying groceries into the house. Her ankle twisted violently. She screamed, "Help!" No one answered. She crawled across the cold driveway, reaching for her phone. The first number she called, Ethan. No answer. He was teaching his daughter how to ride a bicycle. He hadn't heard the phone. Next, her younger sister. Straight to voicemail. Years earlier, Margaret had mocked her for divorcing an abusive husband. They hadn't spoken since. Then, a former friend. Blocked. Another relative declined. Finally, the ambulance arrived. Two paramedics carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. One of them looked strangely familiar. Margaret squinted. "You." The woman smiled gently. "You probably don't remember me." Margaret didn't. "I used to clean your house." Then the memory hit. The maid whose tears she mocked. Margaret looked away in embarrassment, yet the woman still adjusted Margaret's blanket carefully. "We're going to take good care of you." There was no revenge. Only professionalism. For the first time, Margaret felt smaller than she ever had. The injury required surgery. Recovery took months. Visitors rarely came. Most days, the television stayed on simply to break the silence. She watched elderly patients surrounded by children and grandchildren. Flowers arrived every morning for them. Laughter echoed through the hallways. Margaret's room remained quiet. No balloons. No gifts. No family. Only nurses doing their jobs. One afternoon, an elderly woman across the hall passed away peacefully. Her entire family had gathered around her bed. They held her hands, sang her favorite songs, told stories through tears. Margaret watched from her doorway. When the room became empty later that night, she cried, not because the woman had died, because someone had loved her enough to stay until the very end. Margaret suddenly realized money could buy flowers, but never genuine affection. Weeks later, she was discharged. The mansion felt colder than the hospital. Dust covered the furniture. The refrigerator was nearly empty. She sat alone at the massive dining table built for 12 people. One plate, one fork, one chair occupied. The silence was unbearable. That night she found an old photo album. Pictures of Ethan as a little boy. Richard smiling while teaching him to fish. Family vacations. Birthday cakes. Christmas mornings. She remembered something painful. In nearly every picture, someone else was smiling. She wasn't. She was criticizing the decorations, complaining about food, correcting someone's posture. She had been physically present, but emotionally absent. For the first time in decades, Margaret cried without anger, without pride, without excuses, just regret. The next morning, she drove to Ethan's house. Her hands trembled as she rang the doorbell. Lily opened the door. The woman Margaret had spent years humiliating. Their eyes met. Margaret looked down. "I know, I don't deserve forgiveness." Lily remained silent. "I only came to say I'm sorry." The words felt unfamiliar, heavy, real. "I hurt you because I thought control meant strength." A tears rolled down Margaret's face. "I was wrong." Lily didn't answer immediately. Then she quietly called, "Ethan." He stepped outside. His face showed surprise, then caution. Margaret could barely meet his eyes. "I failed you." Silence. "I kept waiting for everyone to rescue me." She wiped away tears. "But I spent my whole life pushing everyone away." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then asked softly, "Why now?" Margaret looked toward the ground. "Because when I cried for help, nobody came." Her voice broke completely. "And I finally understood why." Ethan didn't hug her immediately. Some wounds take longer to heal than apologies. Instead, he invited her inside for tea. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a beginning. Over the following months, Margaret worked to earn back trust instead of demanding it. She volunteered at a local shelter, quietly serving meals without expecting praise. She wrote handwritten apology letters to former employees, neighbors, and relatives. Some ignored her, some forgave her. Others simply wished her well from a distance. She accepted every response, because she had finally learned that forgiveness is a gift, not a debt. One spring afternoon, she visited Richard's grave. She placed fresh white lilies beside the stone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I spent so much time trying to make people fear me, that I forgot how to love them." A gentle breeze rustled the trees around her. For years, Margaret had believed power came from making others feel small. Now she understood the truth. Real strength is found in kindness. Real wealth is measured by the people who willingly stand beside you. And real love can never be demanded. It must be earned, protected, and returned. By the time Margaret reached the end of her life, her house was no longer filled with servants or expensive parties. Instead, on quiet Sunday afternoons, Ethan, Lily, and her grandchildren came over for homemade soup and simple conversations. The mansion had become smaller, but the home had finally become warmer. Margaret never forgot the day she cried for help and no one came. Because that lonely moment became the beginning of the life she should have lived all along. Sometimes the greatest punishment isn't losing money, power, or status. It's realizing too late that the people you pushed away were the only ones who could have made your life truly rich.